In the year 1625, an Italian noble named Pietro della Valle traveled through parts of the Middle East. He had already visited areas of Asia, North Africa, and even India. He met and married an Assyrian Christian princess in Damascus, and she went with him on his journeys. Together, they rode horses and camels with help from local guides. It was a dangerous time since the Ottoman and Persian empires were at war. They fought over control of Baghdad, and roaming bandits took advantage of the widespread chaos. Even lions lived in those hills. Because of these threats, the guides who led Pietro and his wife were always looking around nervously. On June 18th of that year, they saw a group of tribesmen far away. The guides became worried and tried to find a safe place to hide. They spotted some huge ruins on the horizon and decided to stay there. Pietro wrote later that his group moved about a mile farther and set up camp near the remains of some old buildings. They stayed among those ruins for several nights, hoping to arrange safe travel with the local ruler. The heat of the summer sun was intense, and during the day, Pietro passed the time by exploring the deserted buildings. He noticed that the walls had been built with strong bricks, many of which had strange symbols stamped into them. Instead of lime, they were stuck together with something like tar or pitch. The ground around him was covered in bits of stone and broken brick, all marked with curious writing that looked ancient. He found pieces of black marble carved with those same symbols, and he spotted two shapes repeated on many bricks. One shape looked like a small pyramid, and the other looked like an 8-pointed star. Pietro and his wife had no idea that they had stumbled upon the ruins of Ur, a city that had been at the center of one of the earliest civilizations in human history. This civilization is called Sumer, and it is where many ideas that shape our modern world got their start. Negotiations for safe travel eventually failed, so Pietro's group packed up and left under the cover of night, making their way across the desert. Pietro took a few clay tablets he had found on the ground. These tablets were the first pieces of this lost language ever brought back to Europe. On his return journey, he must have turned those tablets over and over in his hands, thinking about the symbols pressed into the clay. He likely wondered who built those enormous mounds of old bricks out in the lonely desert. He must have asked himself what the ancient symbols meant and how such a great city could vanish without a trace. That ancient city, Ur, belonged to a people we now call the Sumerians. They lived in southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today, that region is mostly in Iraq. The Sumerians are thought to have created one of the earliest advanced civilizations. Over many centuries, they built large cities, invented one of the first systems of writing, developed mathematics, and created the wheel. They rose to an incredible level of power and culture, but then they collapsed, leaving their once bustling cities in ruins. It can be fascinating to study how they managed to grow and thrive for so long, and what caused everything to fall apart. In the highlands of southeastern Turkey, there is a range of limestone mountains called the Taurus Range. These peaks soar over 3,000 meters high, and they block the path of many rain clouds. As a result, the mountains get a good amount of yearly rainfall. During spring and summer, fierce storms roll through the hills and echo in the valleys. Water is everywhere in this landscape, shaping streams, rivers, and huge caves. Ancient peoples saw that water was a force to be feared and honored. They imagined storm gods riding on the backs of mighty bulls. Since thunder in the mountains can sound like the rumbling of giant hooves, several streams flow down from these mountains and merge into two broad rivers that run nearly parallel for thousands of kilometers across what is now Iraq. These two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they have fed human life in the region for millennia. The Greeks called this area Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers. The waters carry fine particles called silt, which is good for farming because it helps soil hold water and air. Silt forms from mineral fragments like quartz and feldspar that do not dissolve easily. As the rivers flow downstream, they deposit this silt on the flat plains, making the land fertile and inviting for agriculture. At the same time, this region has a very hot, dry climate, with summer temperatures that can reach over 50 degrees Celsius. Rain can be scarce, and strong winds blow over the plains. The floods can be unpredictable too, because the amount of rain in the northern mountains varies from year to year. Some years bring drought, while others bring huge floods. Southern Iraq also has few raw materials like stone or metal. Despite these difficulties, this plain became home to some of the oldest cities in human history. Early humans did not rush to settle in this desert environment. They preferred more favorable regions in the upper parts of the rivers. People made simple tools there, like stone axes, nearly 500,000 years ago. But eventually, about 13,000 years ago, people learned that discarded seeds in their garbage heaps could sprout new plants. By planting seeds in the ground, watering them and caring for them, they could secure a steady supply of food. This shift to farming led some groups to settle in permanent villages. They stored food in granaries, made pots, and created more complex social structures to manage group work and protect their harvests. In time, these early farmers expanded deeper into Mesopotamia, down along the Tigris and Euphrates. They became skilled at digging channels to bring river water into fields away from the riverbank. This made it possible to grow many more crops as long as people built and maintained canals. Around 6500 BC, these farmers started moving into the southern part of the region. That stretch of thousands of years is sometimes called the Ubaid period, named after a site where artifacts from that time were discovered. These early inhabitants noticed that date palms could thrive in some areas of the river delta. Dates provided a good source of sugar and calories. They also learned to grow other fruits and vegetables in gardens shaded by the tall palms. Over generations, they perfected the practice of irrigation, and small villages turned into bigger, more organized communities. They built storehouses for crops, made pots, and developed specialized jobs. All of these steps led to the rise of the first known cities in southern Mesopotamia. This is what we call Sumer. The Sumerian people, along with their neighbors, the Akkadians, lived in the area that became a cradle of early civilization. The Semitic-speaking Akkadians lived more to the north. Their language was related to later tongues like Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic. The Sumerians spoke a completely different language that does not seem to be related to any other language family we know of. Some historians wonder if the Sumerians came from outside Mesopotamia, arriving by sea or from another distant land. Others think they were always there, developing their language and culture in the marshy southern plains. Myths and legends speak of half-fish, half-human beings who emerged from the ocean and taught people how to plant seeds, build and write. Another story talks about a flood that covered the world, which is similar to the tale found in the Bible about Noah's Ark. Though scholars debate these points, the origins of the Sumerians remain partly mysterious. What we do know is that the Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people. Images suggest they wore their hair curly on top and shorter on the sides, and both men and women liked jewelry of copper, gold, and precious stones. They also loved music, which they wrote down on clay tablets, creating an early system for musical notation. They left records explaining how to play and tune their instruments, so we have some idea of how their songs sounded thousands of years ago. The Sumerians and Akkadians lived side by side, sharing much of their culture, trading goods, blending ideas, and also facing many of the same troubles. The Sumerians named their homeland the land of the noble lords, and wrote about those who lived in the mountains as wild and uncivilized. To them, life outside the fertile plain seemed hostile, with deserts to the south and west, and steep mountains full of roaming tribes to the north and east. Living in this challenging region forced the Sumerians to adapt and become inventive. They had no forests to provide timber, so they used reeds to build many things. They had no stone or abundant metal, so they learned to mold the river mud into bricks, pottery, and even sickles. They used the bitumen from the region to waterproof bricks. They invented or adopted the plow, the pottery wheel, the wagon wheel, and the sailboat. They also discovered how to cast copper and later bronze. Sumerians developed early math, measured land, and created multiplication tables. They divided the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees. We still use this system of time and angles today. They built extensive networks of canals for irrigation and transportation. They raised levees, dug reservoirs, and directed water through sluice gates. Managing all of this required detailed planning and a system to record it, which may have encouraged them to create a writing method. Early on, they used clay tokens to keep track of goods. Later, they drew pictures on clay surfaces to represent animals or items. Over time, these shapes simplified into wedge marks pressed into wet clay with a stylus made of reed, a script we now call cuneiform. At first, cuneiform signs stood for whole words, but eventually people realized that symbols could represent sounds too. This revolution in communication helped them track everything from trade agreements to poems about the gods. Around 5400 BC, the city of Eridu was founded. Some believe it was the oldest city on Earth. Records written later claim the first kings ruled there for thousands of years, which is probably an exaggeration. Many historians consider Eridu the birthplace of Sumerian culture, though over time many other cities arose. Each city had a temple to its main god or goddess, with priests or priest-kings in charge. Early cities often had small populations, but they were highly organized. They built grand temples out of mud bricks, practiced specialized crafts, and did not appear to fight many large-scale wars at first. City walls were not always needed, suggesting that peace was common in the early days. As time went on, population grew and conflicts between city-states became more frequent. Some of the best-known Sumerian cities included Eridu, Lagash, and Uruk. Uruk became famous for its grand walls, which were later described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. By 3500 BC, Uruk experienced a rise in pottery production, but pieces were simpler in style, made quickly on a fast wheel instead of slowly on a hand-turned wheel. This signaled a change toward mass production. Some scholars think this shift also shows bigger social changes, such as more workers, more trade, and greater demand for everyday goods. As cities expanded, competition over farmland and trade routes led to more militarized rulers. Large walls became a necessity. The king or high priest, called the ensi, often needed armies of foot soldiers to protect farmland, canals, and livestock. One city called Lagash fought neighboring over a boundary. A carved stone, known as the Stele of the Vultures, shows soldiers marching in tight squares with spears and shields, led by King Ernatum on foot. Victory was celebrated by writing inscriptions about the event, praising the city's main god and cursing anyone who might damage the monument. King Ernatum of Lagash forced surrounding areas to pay tribute, though many resented this. After his death, a ruler named Lugal-Zagesi from the city of defeated Lagash and claimed he ruled from the sea in the south to the sea in the north. Controlling that much land proved difficult, and soon a man named Sargon rose to power in the city of Kish. According to legend, he had humble origins and was discovered as a baby floating in a basket on a river, though it is unclear how much of that story is fact or myth. Sargon assembled an army and waged multiple campaigns, defeating Lugal-Zagesi and capturing him. He founded the city of Akkad and called himself King of Sumer and Akkad. He pulled down city walls to prevent rebellion and placed trusted officials in conquered areas. After decades of rule, people grew unhappy with Akkadian dominance and revolts flared up. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, continued his policies but also declared himself a god-king. A rock carving shows him standing proudly above defeated enemies, wearing a horned crown. Some say these claims of divinity angered the Sumerians and may have caused more rebellions. Eventually, during the rule of Shah Kali Shari, the empire of Akkad weakened due to long droughts that reduced crop yields. People in outlying cities had to abandon their homes. The Guti, a group from the mountains, swept in during this fragile time. Mesopotamian texts describe them as strange barbarians who destroyed farmland and order. The Guti defeated Akkad, but they did not run the region efficiently, partly because they had no system of writing to handle administration. People soon became fed up, and various cities rebelled against Guti rule. In the south, a Sumerian leader named Utu-Hengal rose to fight the Guti. He succeeded in capturing their king, Tirigan, and declared freedom for Sumer. Not long after, Ur-Nammu, one of Utu-Hengal's generals, took power for himself. Ur-Nammu built up the city of Ur, raising towering temples called ziggurats with steep steps leading to the top. These ziggurats were often painted white and might have been planted with gardens on different levels. Ur-Nammu's code of laws, which outlined fines and punishments, is one of the earliest legal codes found. His dynasty, called the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur III, tried to revive the glory of Sumer. Though the land remained under strain from drought, changes in river flow and rising soil salt levels that harmed crops. Farmers were forced to switch from wheat to barley, which tolerates salt better. The city of Ur became wealthy through trade, importing lapis lazuli, copper, and other goods from distant regions. Their farmers grew fruits, vegetables, and grains. People wrote poems, wove cloth, and produced intricate art. But trouble kept mounting. Nomadic groups like the Matu, or Amorites, pressed in from the west, and the Elamites gained strength to the east in what is now Iran. In an effort to keep out nomads, the king Shu-Sin built a 300-kilometer wall between the two rivers, but this was hard to defend. Ibbi-Sin, the last ruler of Ur, saw the empire crumble when the Elamites and their allies invaded. One by one, cities fell. Ur was besieged and ultimately destroyed, and Ibbi-Sin was taken prisoner. His city's temples were looted, and the ruins were left silent. Sumerian poets mourned the loss of their beloved cities, writing heartbroken verses about empty streets and shattered walls. Many survivors fled, traveling to places with more reliable farmland or safer towns. Over time, people stopped speaking Sumerian in everyday life, turning to Akkadian instead. Sumerian still survived in temples and schools, as scribes studied the old texts, much like Latin later did in medieval Europe. But as a living language on the streets, Sumerian faded away. In the centuries that followed, new powers such as Babylonia and Assyria grew strong in Mesopotamia. Still, they remembered the Sumerians and sometimes tried to rebuild great cities like Uruk and Ur. Tales circulated about vast towers built by ancient peoples who angered the gods and lost everything. Over the millennia, the rivers changed course, and the land around the old Sumerian sites turned barren. Some dunes of shifting sand and patches of desert were all that remained. Deep beneath the desert lay old bricks and clay tablets full of wedge-shaped writing. People in modern times rediscovered these ruins and began to read the cuneiform tablets left behind. Scholars pieced together the stories of Sumer's rise and fall. They were amazed to learn of a people who invented new forms of writing, new kinds of math, and complex systems of trade, yet later vanished into the dust. Some old Sumerian writings speak of how quickly life can change. They compare humans to insects that skim the surface of a river, only to vanish in a moment. While the Sumerian civilization ended long ago, its achievements still affect our world, from the way we count time to ideas about city life and government. Their language may be gone, but their legacy survives through the words pressed into clay, the stories passed down, and the amazing structures hidden under the sands. When explorers in modern times, like Pietro della Valle, found ancient bricks stamped with odd symbols, they had no idea these were the remains of the Sumerian world. Over the centuries, historians and archaeologists worked to uncover the truth about that lost place. They found evidence of huge cities, tall stepped temples, carefully organized farmland, and a society that understood math, writing, and even music in a way that no group of people had before. In the end, the Sumerians and their neighbors faced drought, shifting rivers, and pressure from outside attackers. Their once thriving cities fell, leaving behind lonely walls and broken statues. Time eventually buried many of those places until only hills of rubble marked where they had once stood. Yet, the people who walked through Sumer's streets and prayed in its towering temples passed down knowledge that shaped later civilizations. The story of Sumer's collapse contains universal lessons. Societies can rise to incredible heights, but they rely on resources like water and farmland. If those resources dwindle, or if enemies become too strong, even mighty kingdoms can fall. In Sumer, salt built up in the soil from repeated irrigation, floods came and went unpredictably, and conflicts with outside tribes wore down the cities. The empire tried to protect itself with walls and armies, but it could not hold back the pressures forever. Eventually, foes from the eastern hills broke through the defenses, the city of Ur was destroyed, and the last king disappeared in chains. The old poems of lament tell how heartbreak spread through the empty streets. Families fled with only the clothes on their backs. The brilliant achievements of Sumer became dusty ruins. Centuries later, Greek visitors wondered about the strange mounds they saw in the desert. Arab travelers told stories of times when mighty places once stood in those empty spots. Many cultures developed myths about a tower that reached to heaven, or a flood that covered the world, which might have started with memories of these ancient events. People who live today, reading about Sumer's tragedies, might feel sadness at how greatness can slip away. Yet we also learn how human creativity, like writing, art, and law codes, can endure. Bits of that culture still exist in libraries and museums, on old clay tablets that experts have spent years deciphering. In modern Iraq, there have been efforts to rebuild libraries lost to war and to protect ancient sites like Ur and Uruk. Some groups are dedicated to gathering books for students in cities like Mosul, where conflict destroyed huge collections of literature. They hope that by studying the past, people can avoid repeating old mistakes. The modern world owes much to the Sumerians, who planted seeds for new ideas, wrote down their thoughts on clay tablets, and built some of the world's earliest cities. Their story reminds us that every civilization, no matter how grand, exists in a delicate balance with nature and with neighbors. Over many centuries, that balance can shift, leaving even the greatest towns as piles of bricks in the sand. When Pietro della Valle picked up a few clay tablets from the ground, he was unknowingly carrying a piece of Sumer's lost heritage across the world. At home, he gazed at the strange symbols, imagining a time when people worshipped in massive temples, practiced laws, told stories, and counted the days using a base 60 system. He must have wondered what disaster caused them to vanish. He could not read cuneiform, so he had no way to unlock the mysteries of that land. But much later, researchers cracked the code, discovering songs, proverbs, laws, and records of farmland purchases that told the tale of the Sumerians. They saw that though the Sumerians disappeared, their influence lived on in future empires like Babylon, Assyria, and beyond. Their memory lasted in stories of giant floods and half-fish teachers, in the shape of ziggurats that may have inspired later temple designs, and in the many myths that reflect echoes of Sumer's own epics. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, farmed along long canals, and used carefully measured bricks to build some of the first monumental towers. They shaped math and writing in ways still felt today. They had times of peace and prosperity, but also times of strife and war. The big lesson they offer is that human creativity can shine even in a harsh environment. But if natural resources run low and enemies gather at the gates, collapse can happen. Their success and downfall both began with the same resource, the water of the rivers. That water brought riches, and it also carried salt to the soil. It allowed farmland to thrive, yet it also fed unstoppable floods. When the rivers changed or an outside army arrived, even high walls and war chariots could not save the cities forever. Historians still argue about where the Sumerians originally came from. Some believe they were native to southern Mesopotamia, and their language simply developed over time. Others think they might have come from farther away, possibly from somewhere along the Gulf Coast or even beyond. Clues might be hidden in old myths that mention half-divine beings teaching new skills to the people of the land. Yet there is no clear proof. Over thousands of years, many records were lost or destroyed, leaving holes in our knowledge. Archaeologists keep digging, hoping to piece more facts together. Even so, the story of Sumer as we know it is already astonishing. It shows how human society can begin with small farming villages and, through centuries of work, become bustling cities that produce art, complex laws, and new science. Today, travelers can visit the remains of Ur in southern Iraq, where the outlines of the old ziggurat still stand. They can picture the once busy streets, the reed boats tied up along canals, and the markets trading fine goods from faraway places. They can imagine the rich farmland that used to surround the city. But the desert has spread, and the Euphrates River no longer flows beside Ur as it once did. Instead, there is mostly dry land, with only scattered hints of the mighty city that stood there long ago. The same pattern appears across many parts of ancient In these places, archaeologists have dug up thousands of clay tablets with wedge-shaped writing, sealed inside jars or stored in old building rooms. These writings whisper about trade agreements, festival records, and even letters about everyday matters like the price of grain. They also contain myths and poems that people recited in the temples or learned in the scribal schools. Taken together, these texts show us what life was like for a civilization at the dawn of history. The Sumerians may not have been the only ancient group to invent writing, but their system is among the earliest known. Other parts of the world, such as Egypt and the Indus Valley, also developed complex writing around the same time. Yet the Sumerians' mark on human progress cannot be denied. They gave us many building blocks of city life, from organized agriculture to a full-time army, from specialized crafts to laws carved into stelae. They raised the first ziggurats toward the sky, believed to be bridges between earth and heaven. They revered gods who controlled the unpredictable floods. They wrote epic stories, like the tale of a mighty king who traveled far and learned about life and mortality. Even if these stories changed over the centuries, they inspired later peoples who read them. When we think about the end of Sumer, it can feel sad to picture a once vibrant city like Ur left in ruins. But no city or empire lasts forever. The Sumerians rose, flourished, and then dissolved into the dust of history. Pieces of their knowledge and culture continued through the Babylonians, Assyrians, and others who followed. Their language became a learned tongue for priests and scribes, rather than a language for daily conversations. Their technology for building canals, forging metals, and writing on clay was passed down and improved upon. They were not entirely forgotten, but people for many generations after them only had legends about who built the giant mounds scattered across the plains. Much later, explorers like Pietro della Valle saw traces of cuneiform symbols. He had no idea that those symbols once recorded stories about vast floods, journeys of gods, and the daily concerns of temple workers and farmers. He also did not know that the lumps of clay he carried home would one day help scholars decode a lost language. Countless others contributed to understanding these ancient tablets over the years, putting together the puzzle of Sumerian civilization. The process is ongoing. New findings still happen, often from digs in Iraq or in museum collections not yet fully studied. Each discovery offers a glimpse into one of the earliest chapters of city life on Earth. In modern times, conflict in the region has sometimes damaged cultural treasures, including many libraries and museums. Groups dedicated to preserving heritage strive to save what remains and to restore what was lost. There is a hope that knowledge of the past will help create a better future. The memory of how Sumer rose and fell might guide today's leaders when they face droughts, floods, wars, and other problems. The Sumerians teach us that no matter how clever a society becomes, it must handle its environment with care and keep peace with its neighbors. Otherwise, even the mightiest civilization can crumble. The story of the Sumerians, therefore, is one of both progress and peril. They showed how people, by working together, could build canals, walls, schools, temples, and even entire writing systems. They proved that humans can achieve remarkable feats in harsh settings. However, their downfall reminds us that too many challenges can overwhelm even the best planning. After centuries of drought, salt-ridden soil, and invasions by well-armed neighbors, the cities could not stand. The last king of Ur was led away in chains, and the old temples were smashed to dust. For thousands of years afterward, travelers who passed by those sites saw only rubble. They created myths to explain what had once been there. In later centuries, with better study of ancient languages, people understood that these ruins belonged to a civilization that had a deep impact on human history. It was the same land where writing, complex laws, and grand building projects took root. By reading the poetry and records the Sumerians left behind, we can still hear their voices. We sense their joys, fears, and hopes. They remind us that history stretches far beyond our modern view, and that entire nations can vanish, leaving only echoes of their existence in old tales and buried artifacts. In these remains, a person might find a contract about buying land or a prayer to a storm god. One might find a ledger tracking shipments of barley and dried fish, or a lullaby for a child. Such details shine a light on real people who lived, worked, and prayed thousands of years ago. They knew what it was like to watch the river rise in flood season and to hope the walls would hold. They knew the taste of bread and beer, the ring of a bronze tool, and the scent of hot desert wind. They had families, arguments, and jokes. They were human beings, facing the challenges of life in the earliest cities of the world. Today, we still admire their efforts. Though the farmland around Ur is not as rich as it once was, one can stand among the remains of the ziggurat and imagine the holy processions climbing each level, carrying offerings to the sky. One can picture scribes pressing marks into soft clay, carefully recording trade deals or religious hymns. One can think of the fishermen pushing reed boats through winding marsh channels, bringing fish to market. All that is gone, but in a way it lingers in the stories and written tablets we have rediscovered. In this way, Sumer lives on, speaking to us from a time when civilization was new. Their inventions shaped the direction of human progress. Their downfall warns us of how quickly things can change. The two rivers that gave them life could also bring death, and the nomads outside their borders could become enemies at any moment. The dryness of the land, the need for irrigation, and the power of the mountains shaped the fate of this civilization. We can think of them as among the first to tame nature on a grand scale. That struggle left an imprint on how later empires built their own canals, walls, and armies. The Sumerians tried to hold back the tide of change, but drought and conflict were too strong in the end. The city of Ur was stormed, looted, and burned. People escaped with what they could carry, leaving behind storerooms of clay tablets, golden treasures, and religious relics. In the poems they left, we hear sorrow and lament for these lost glories. We hear them blame themselves, the gods, or harsh fate for what happened. These ancient voices confirm that even thousands of years ago, people felt grief and regret. They wrote down their pain so future generations would know their story. In that story, there is also a kind of beauty. We see the cycle of human life, where greatness rises from small beginnings, only to dissolve eventually. The Sumerians were not the first or the last to experience that pattern, but they were among the earliest we know of. Their existence paved the way for later civilizations that built upon their achievements. And though their language is now found only in old inscriptions, it was once the tongue of a bustling world full of music, trade, and faith. When modern readers imagine Pietro della Valle standing in the ruins of Ur, holding clay tablets stamped with the earliest known form of writing, it can feel like a meeting of two worlds. One was an Italian traveler of the 17th century, braving war-torn deserts. The other was a civilization thousands of years older than him, already reduced to heaps of brick. He wondered who these people were. Today, we know they were the Sumerians, and they were among the first to show what humans could do with cooperation, creativity, and drive. Yet, they also showed how an unbalanced environment and hostile neighbors can topple even the best-prepared kingdom. Across the sands of Iraq, that lesson has played out more than once. In later eras, Babylon rose and fell, Assyria built an empire and lost it, and Persia conquered vast lands only to be conquered in turn. The Sumerians were the foundation of it all, setting patterns that others would follow or try to improve. Their city walls, their irrigation systems, their writing on clay tablets, these all laid out the steps for how future empires would organize themselves. But every empire is only as strong as its water supply, its farmland, and its people's unity. When those fail, collapse is near. In the end, the story of the Sumerians is not just about dust and ruined walls. It is also about the early glow of human possibility. It is about seeing how people began to shape the world around them on a large scale and write down their experiences so others could learn from them. Their knowledge remains in countless clay fragments that speak of harvests, laws, kings, and gods. Even if we cannot hear their voices directly, we can still read their words and see the marks of their styluses pressed in wet clay. We can remember that once they thrived in the land between the two rivers, and their influence continues to flow through time, just like those waters that still wind their way through Mesopotamia.